I'll never forget the sound of the clinking glasses or the echo of the laughter that rose up after those words. I was there, sitting at a side table, away from the center, while my son, the very one I dedicated my entire life to, raised his wine glass and said in front of 400 people, "I want to thank my father-in-law. Without him, this party wouldn't exist. My father, well, he's over there." And he gestured with his glass toward me, with a look of contempt that left no room for doubt. There was a brief silence, as if everyone in the room was wondering if that had been a mistake, a misunderstanding. But then someone laughed, and then another, and within seconds, all 400 voices joined in, a laughter that pierced my chest like daggers. It wasn't polite laughter, no. It was mockery, complicit in the insult, a collective scorn for a 61-year-old man who, in that instant, understood just how alone he was. I felt their eyes on me, some amused, some uncomfortable, others frankly cruel. And while they all got swept up in that moment of humiliation, I remained motionless, my hands on the table, gripping the tablecloth, as if that simple gesture was the only thing keeping me from falling apart in front of everyone. He kept talking as if nothing had happened, as if I were nothing more than a shadow in the ballroom, someone who had to be there because blood demanded it, but not because his heart recognized me. I looked at him and could hardly believe it. I had seen him born. I had held his fragile body in my arms. I had worked endless shifts to give him a roof over his head and an education. I had sacrificed my own dreams so he could build his. And now, on the most important day of his life, he reduced me to a simple, "He's over there." Not even my dad, not even an empty gesture of respect, just that cruel phrase that turned every guest into a witness to my defeat. The air in the room got thick. I could hear the murmurs, the glasses being raised, the conversations starting up again as if nothing had happened. But inside me, something shattered. I wanted to stand up and scream at all of them, to tell them what I had done for him. I wanted to tell them how my back had bent from hauling tools, how my hands had cracked and calloused so he could have what I never had. But I didn't. I stayed silent, watching, because in that moment I understood that any word from me would be seen as the pathetic complaint of a bitter old man. The banquet continued, the musicians kept playing, the photographers captured smiles, and I felt like every note of that music was mocking me. I looked around and saw my in-laws, friends, my son's colleagues, the businessmen he admired so much, and they all seemed more focused on the image of success and happiness than on the reality of what had just happened. To them, I was just a background character, a man from the past who should stay quiet, grateful just to be invited. My pride as a father meant nothing in that room. It had been replaced by shame, but the worst was yet to come. When dinner ended and the guests began to rise for another toast, the waiter approached me holding a black leather folder. I leaned in, curious, thinking it must be a mistake. But when I opened it, I felt my blood run cold. There, perfectly itemized, was the bill for the wedding. $300,000. $300,000 that had come from my pockets, from my savings, from the life I had mortgaged in the name of a son who now pointed at me with contempt. The waiter handed me the folder, never suspecting he was carrying the bomb that would blow this whole farce apart. I looked up. My son was still laughing, surrounded by his wife, his father-in-law, and his friends. No one seemed to be thinking about the cost of this party, about the months of planning, about the sacrifices I had made to support it. Because it was I and no one else who had organized everything, who had negotiated with the vendors, who had put up the money without showing off, who believed this day was a chance to seal the union of a family. And there he was, giving all the credit to his father-in-law, stripping me of my place as if my effort was invisible. In that moment, I stood up. The murmuring slowly died down. I walked toward the center of the ballroom, the folder in my hands. An expectant silence fell. Everyone watched me, some with curiosity, some with annoyance, others with that nervousness you feel just before something breaks. I opened the folder and showed the bill, the numbers clear, undeniable. $300,000, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I watched the smiles fade, watched my son turn pale, watched his father-in-law swallow hard. The naked truth was shining in front of everyone. Then, in a gesture no one saw coming, I took the bill and tore it into pieces right in front of their eyes. The paper ripped with a sound like a gunshot. The pieces fluttered to the floor like dirty snow announcing the end of a lie. "Now it's your problem," I said, and my voice echoed in the hall with the force of thunder. No one dared to laugh. No one clapped. The silence was absolute, a silence that weighed more than all the laughter I had endured just minutes before. And there, in the middle of that ballroom, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. After that humiliation, when I got back to my house that same night, I sat in the dim light of the dining room, my hands still shaking with rage and sadness. On the table were the remains of a cold coffee I hadn't been able to drink, and all around me, everything felt emptier than ever. I closed my eyes, and as if the silence of the early morning forced me to go back, I began to remember everything I had given for my son, everything I had sacrificed without asking for anything in return, and how every one of those memories, which used to fill me with pride, now turned into daggers in my chest as I realized he had never valued any of it. I saw him born in a small hospital room where the walls seemed to sweat from the heat and the exhaustion of that long night. I remember how he cried with a force that made me think, this kid is going to be strong, stronger than me. I took him in my arms and swore he would never lack for anything, that I would do the impossible so he could live a better life than I had. That oath became my compass, the engine for my days, the relief in my nights, even if no one else knew. When he was 5, I held his hand on his first day of school. He was nervous, squeezing my fingers hard, and I told him everything would be okay, that the teachers would be nice, and that he'd make friends. When I left him at the door, I knew I was giving a part of myself to the world. While other parents just left, I stayed a moment longer, watching from a distance, until I was sure he wasn't crying, until I saw him walk in confidently. That was my first big letting him go, even if just for a few hours, hoping he would learn to fly. But flying costs, and every wing needs support. So I worked tirelessly, first in jobs that tore my hands and back apart, then in more stable jobs that stole my sleep, but always with the same purpose, that he would never go hungry, that he'd have clean clothes, new notebooks, shoes that didn't hurt his feet. I remember spending entire winters in the same old coat because I'd rather spend money on a new jacket for him than for me. I remember turning down opportunities for myself, little luxuries I never allowed, because what I had was barely enough for his future. Over the years, I watched him grow and change. There were afternoons when I'd come home exhausted, dragging my feet, and I'd still sit with him to go over his multiplication tables or listen to his endless stories about school. There were nights he got sick, and I'd stay up with him, putting damp cloths on his forehead, terrified the fever would take him. And there were days, too, when he'd come home with bad grades and look at me with fear, expecting a punishment that never came. I wasn't a perfect father, but I tried to be a fair one, a patient one, a present one. When he became a teenager, the distance began to grow. He didn't ask for my advice anymore. He didn't hang around the shop with me. He didn't want to hear my stories from when I was young. He preferred to lock himself in his room or go out with friends. I understood. It was part of life. Part of that process where kids pull away from their parents. It hurt, but I accepted it, because I believed that deep down he loved me, even if he didn't say it. I trusted that one day, as an adult, he would recognize everything I did for him. I remember the first time he asked for money to buy brand-name clothes. I knew it was an unnecessary expense, that what he had was fine, but I saw how excited he was, so I worked overtime and gave it to him. And though he didn't say it out loud, I saw a glint of satisfaction in his eyes that made me feel it was worth it. I also remember when he wanted to go to the most expensive college in the city. Even though I knew it would be a massive sacrifice, I agreed. I sold tools, I took out loans, I juggled the household expenses, because that's what a father does. You swallow your pride and break your back for your kid's future. And yet, here I was, after all these years, remembering all that with a lump in my throat, knowing that to him it all boiled down to one gesture of contempt in the middle of a lavish wedding. All my effort had been erased in an instant. The cold winters didn't matter, nor the sleepless nights, nor the debts I was still carrying. It didn't matter that if it weren't for me, that party would never have existed. I was invisible to him, an inconvenient decoration, someone he barely recognized as part of his story. That night, as I replayed every memory, I understood it hadn't been an oversight or a momentary mistake. My son had chosen to deny my existence because it was more comfortable, because in his new world of appearances, I didn't fit in. And in that moment, sitting alone in my dining room, I knew that what I had lost wasn't the respect of others, but something much more painful, the respect of my own son. They always say a child's youth is the purest treasure a father keeps in his memory, a chest full of laughter, clumsy steps, unexpected hugs, and little words that become eternal. And yes, for many years I believed that, I felt that every moment shared with him was a jewel I had to protect. But since the humiliation at his wedding, when I look back on his childhood, I can't see those memories in the same light. Now, every scene seems tinged with a shadow I failed to recognize at the time, as if his betrayal had taken root long before I could see it. I remember, for example, when he was just 6 years old and a neighbor caught him throwing rocks at his car window. The man came over, furious, to complain, and I, though embarrassed, defended my son, saying he was just a kid, that he didn't know what he was doing. When I spoke to him later, instead of showing remorse, he looked me straight in the eye and said with a strangely firm voice, "It doesn't matter, Dad. You'll always defend me." At the time, I took it as a naive phrase, as the security of a son who trusts his father. But remembering it now, I realize it was also a warning. He already understood he could do whatever he wanted because I would always be there to save him, to clean up his messes. I also think of the days I'd take him to the park. I'd watch him run after a ball, laugh with other kids, and I'd feel this immense pride, as if the world was giving me a small reward for so much sacrifice. However, there were gestures that I now understand differently. Sometimes he'd make fun of smaller kids, push them, snatch their toys. When I scolded him, he'd cross his arms, look at me defiantly and say, "So what? You'll just buy me another one anyway." Back then, I justified it, saying he was mischievous, that it was part of growing up, that he'd learned to be better. But today I know I was spoiling him. With every concession, with every excuse, I was teaching him that he could walk all over others and still be rewarded. I can't help but remember one rainy afternoon. He must have been about 10. We had come home soaked, and when I opened his backpack, I discovered he had deliberately ripped up his notebooks, drawing crude pictures on the covers. When I asked him why he'd done it, he replied that he didn't like studying, that he didn't need to learn because one day he'd have everything thanks to me. It was like a slap in the face disguised as childish sincerity. I was silent, unable to respond. I, who had barely finished grade school and was killing myself so he could have what I never had, was hearing from his own lips that effort was pointless because I would always be there, holding everything up. A pattern now reveals itself in those memories. My son never learned gratitude. Every gesture of mine, every sacrifice, he saw as an entitlement, not a gift. And I, blinded by love, mistook his indifference for innocence, his disdain for teenage rebellion. I didn't want to see what was right in front of my eyes, that I was raising a man incapable of valuing what he had, a man who, when the time came, would be capable of pointing at me with contempt in front of everyone. I remember when he was 12, I gave him a bicycle. Instead of hugging me with joy, he said, "It's nice, but my friend's is better." That line hurt more than I let on. I smiled and told him that I'd buy him a better one in the future, but inside me, a wound opened up. That wound, over the years, filled up with more phrases like that, with little disappointments that I buried so I wouldn't have to face reality. Because accepting that your son doesn't value you is accepting that you failed somewhere along the way, that all your effort might have been in vain. There were tender moments, of course. I remember nights he'd come running to my bed after a nightmare, seeking refuge in my arms. I remember the day he told me he wanted to be like me when he grew up, and I almost cried with emotion. But now I wonder if those words were sincere, or just part of childish dependence, a fleeting reflection of someone who didn't yet know ambition or pride. Because over time, those phrases disappeared, replaced by demands, by complaints, by comparisons with other fathers who, according to him, gave their kids more freedom or more luxuries. Today, with my heart in pieces, I dare to think that what was to come was already written in his childhood, that my son, from a very early age, learned to take advantage of my love, to manipulate it, to take it for granted, and that I, blinded by tenderness in the dream of watching him grow, became complicit in that ingratitude. I didn't raise him with enough firmness. I didn't confront him when I should have, and that mistake haunts me like a ghost that won't let me sleep. Because now, when I close my eyes, I see him as a child again, with that mischievous look that I found so endearing, and I realize that in that mischief already hid the man who, years later, would humiliate me in front of 400 people. Childhood should be a refuge of warm memories, but for me, it has become a distorted mirror, a mirror that reflects the image of a naive father and a son who, even in his innocence, was already learning how to be a traitor. Over the years, I learned that a woman's silence can be more powerful than her words. Teresa, my wife, my son's mother, was never one to yell or argue in public, but her way of being quiet, of lowering her gaze or letting slip measured phrases laced with invisible poison, had a devastating effect. Many times, after I'd scold the boy for some mischief, she would go to him and whisper something in his ear when she thought I wasn't listening. "Don't pay any attention to your father. He's just tired." Or, "You know how he gets when things don't go his way." Those words, so small, so seemingly harmless, were knives that cut cracks in the image my son had of me. What I tried to build with discipline and love, she undermined with passing comments, with dismissive gestures, with a complicity that cast me in the role of the bad guy. I clearly remember one night we argued because I had worked late and come home exhausted. My son hadn't done his homework, and I reprimanded him. Teresa, instead of backing me up, said in front of him, "Leave him alone. After all, what's the point of all this math? In life, it's about who you know, not what you know." That sentence stuck in my memory, not just because it contradicted my efforts to instill discipline, but because it revealed the mindset she herself carried, a life where appearances and convenience weighed more than truth and effort. I didn't realize it at the time, but I know now that my son absorbed from his mother the idea that I was an obstacle, an old-fashioned man who was only good for working and providing, but who shouldn't be taken seriously as an example. My marriage to Teresa was never simple. I loved her from the moment I met her, with a sincere, clumsy love, ready to give everything. She, on the other hand, was always more calculating. I'm not saying she didn't love me, but her way of loving was conditioned on what I could provide. When we were young, she dreamed of things I couldn't give her, trips, luxuries, jewelry. I did what I could, but it was never enough. Over time, that disappointment turned into resentment, and although she rarely said it to my face, she transmitted it in the way she treated me. And the worst part was that she planted that resentment in our son, too, as if she wanted him to grow up with the idea that I was a limited man, someone worthy of respect out of obligation, but not admiration. There were arguments where she'd accuse me of being too hard, too rigid, of not knowing how to enjoy life. "You're always thinking about money, about work, about the future. When are you going to think about us?" she'd say, forgetting that I worked precisely so they would lack nothing. Sometimes, in the heat of anger, she'd hurl phrases that snapped like whips. "Your son deserves better than a father who only knows how to get his hands dirty in a workshop." And those words, though said in anger, didn't just blow away. My son was there, listening, recording them in his memory, letting himself be influenced by the vision she was planting. I would just stay quiet, powerless, because I knew that arguing would only increase the contempt. Over time, I began to notice that my son preferred to talk to her about any decision before me. He'd ask her for permission, not me. He'd tell her his problems, not me. If I gave an order, he would look to his mother's eyes for a sign of approval before obeying. It was as if she had become the filter between us, as if I had been demoted to a supporting role in my own home. And the most painful part is that I allowed it, because I loved Teresa, and I believed she was doing it for the good of the family. I didn't understand that I was slowly losing my rightful place as a father. Once, when he was 15, he came home late from a party. I was worried, and I waited up for him. When he walked in, I confronted him harshly. I told him he had to respect the rules of the house, that life wasn't a game. He answered me with an insolence that left me frozen. "You shut up. You don't even understand how the world works. Let me talk to Mom." And Teresa, instead of backing me up, hugged him and said to me, "Don't be so dramatic, Michael. Let him live." That was one of the first times I felt I had lost him, that he wasn't my son anymore, but hers. Today, looking back, I realized that the humiliation at his wedding wasn't a spontaneous act. It was the culmination of years of little seeds planted by his mother, of phrases that pushed him away from me, of the construction of an image in which I was merely a provider, a man you thank out of duty but never recognize out of love. Teresa molded our son in her own way, and I, blinded by my love for them both, let it happen. The cruelest part is that even though she's gone now, her voice still echoes in my son every time he looks at me with contempt. It's as if she's speaking through him, as if the shadow of our broken marriage is still alive, reminding me that in the silent war for my son's heart, I was the one who lost. I always thought that when my son reached adulthood, he'd find the maturity he seemed to lack as a kid. I believed that with age, he'd learn to value what had been built with sacrifice, that he'd understand life doesn't just hand you things, that behind every plate of food are hands that got dirty, behind every roof are backs that were broken. But I was wrong. His entry into the adult world wasn't an awakening of gratitude, but the beginning of an obsession with appearances, with building a successful-looking life made of masks. I watched him in college, acting like someone who wasn't studying to learn, but to rub elbows with those who had more money, with those who could open doors for him that I never could. He started bringing friends home, arrogant young men who would laugh at my workshop, who'd make jokes about the smell of wood stain and varnish on my hands. He would join in their laughter, maybe to fit in, maybe because he had already decided I wasn't a role model. And I, holding my tongue out of love, felt each laugh as another brick in the wall separating him from me. Then came his first serious relationships, all with women from wealthy families, daughters of businessmen and politicians, girls who would have never looked twice at him if not for the parties he could throw at our house with my money, or the cars I bought on installment so he could feel like somebody. He didn't care that I went into debt. He didn't see the effort behind everything. He just wanted to shine, to show off, to be seen. And every time I asked him why he didn't look for a more genuine relationship, he'd hit me with lines that chilled my blood. "Dad, in this world, the winner isn't the one who works the hardest. It's the one who hangs out with the right people." That's when his father-in-law appeared on the scene. That man with the big smile and the calculating eyes, who I knew from day one was smarter than all of us put together. He represented everything my son wanted to be. Easy money, social recognition, prestige. It didn't take long for him to become a figure of power in my son's life, someone to admire, to imitate, someone who completely overshadowed the figure of a father who had busted his ass in a workshop for decades. I saw it with my own eyes, how my son leaned in toward him, how he listened intently, how he proudly introduced him as the man to follow. Me, on the other hand, he pushed into the shadows. Family dinners became a stage for showing off while I sat quietly in my worn-out shirt. They talked about investments, about trips, about deals I barely understood. Every word was a reminder that I didn't belong in that world anymore. I remember one night in particular when his father-in-law made a toast, saying, "Your son is like a real son to me." And my son, instead of reacting, just smiled, satisfied, as if he agreed, as if that man could replace me so easily. I felt a pang of pain so sharp that I excused myself before dessert and walked home alone, the echo of that phrase repeating in my head. Over the years, my son began to present himself as a self-made man, a success in his social circle. He posted photos from expensive places, showed off designer clothes, surrounded himself with people who applauded him. But behind that mask, there was no substance, no real effort, no sacrifice. Everything was built on foundations that weren't his, my savings, my loans, my sleepless nights. And he, instead of acknowledging it, invented a story that his father-in-law had been the one to give him his start, the one who helped him become what he was. That lie, repeated so many times, ended up becoming his truth. I watched him from a distance, always present, always silent, trying to convince myself that one day he would wake up, that one day he would see beyond the appearances and recognize me as the true support of his life. But the reality was different. Every step he took moved him further from me and closer to the empty world he admired so much. I'd see him laughing at parties, shaking important hands, giving speeches full of elegant words that meant nothing. And I, who knew the boy he had been, knew that behind that facade was just a fragile man, propped up by someone else's sacrifice. What hurt most was realizing that he didn't just wear that mask for the world, but for me too. He was no longer capable of looking at me as a father. He looked at me like an obstacle, like an uncomfortable reminder of a life he wanted to bury. Every word he spoke to me was dripping with condescension. Every gesture was a way of marking distance. And when he pointed at me with contempt at his wedding, I understood that he would never take that mask off. It was his new skin, and in it, there was no place for me. The moment the waiter approached with that black folder in his hands is burned into my memory, like a photograph. I was sitting there, trying to digest the humiliation of the toast, when I saw him walking toward me with firm steps, crossing the room full of laughter, music, and clinking glasses. I thought it was a mistake, maybe a message for the wrong table, until he placed the folder in front of me with a slight nod. I felt the curious glances of a few people nearby, but no one paid much attention. I opened the folder with the calmness of someone suspecting nothing, and then I saw it. The itemized bill for the entire wedding, with a grand total that left me frozen. $300,000. $300,000 that had come out of my pockets, from my years of savings, from my sleepless nights, from every sacrifice I made without anyone knowing. My hands trembled holding the paper. It wasn't the money that hurt me. I had given every dollar with the dream of seeing my son happy on the most important day of his life. What was tearing me apart was the brutal contrast. Just minutes earlier, he had made a toast thanking his father-in-law while reducing me to a shadow in front of 400 people. And now, this ballroom, lit by luxurious chandeliers, decorated with flowers flown in from God knows where, this orchestra filling the air with music, every bottle of wine uncorked, every satisfied smile, everything, absolutely everything, had been made possible by me. I was the true architect of this party, the only one who had put his body and soul into making it a reality, and yet I had been erased from the story with a gesture of contempt. The paper burned my hands. I looked at it again and again, scanning every line, every number, every item, the catering, the music, the decorations, the liquor. I had paid for all of it, even those little extravagances my son and his wife had demanded without even consulting me, as if it were only natural that I'd be there to cover any whim. And yet, in his speech, I was nothing more than an awkward figure he pointed at with a sneer. The contrast between the bill and his words was so painful, I felt dizzy, as if I couldn't breathe in the crowded room. I looked up. My son was still in the center of the room, laughing with the guests, proud of his wife and his new in-laws. His father-in-law was beside him, glass still raised, enjoying a recognition that didn't belong to him. And I understood in that instant that if I stayed silent one more time, that lie would become permanent. Everyone would believe the father-in-law had financed the wedding, that he was the real provider, while I was relegated to a corner, reduced to a ghost barely worth mentioning. I stood up. I don't know where I found the strength, but I did it with a calmness that surprised even me. I felt the eyes lock onto me as I walked to the center of the ballroom, the folder in my hands. The music slowly faded out, as if the musicians also understood something was about to happen. The murmuring died down, and the only thing left was the sound of my footsteps on the marble floor. When I was in front of everyone, I opened the folder and held up the bill. $300,000, I said, my voice echoing louder than I'd expected. I saw some guests lean forward to read, others' eyes go wide with surprise. My son slowly turned pale. $300,000 is what this wedding cost, and it all came from my pockets. I paused, and the silence was absolute. Not a glass clinked, not a chair creaked. Everyone was waiting for my next word. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I tore the bill into pieces in front of their eyes. The sound of the paper ripping was like a thunderclap in the room. The fragments fluttered to the floor like confetti stained with shame. "Now it's your problem," I added, and I let each syllable land heavily, irrefutably, like a gavel on a judge's bench. The reactions were instant. Some covered their mouths, unable to hide their shock. Others looked at each other, bewildered, as if they didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The father-in-law, who just a moment ago was smiling with self-satisfaction, was frozen, his glass halfway between the table and his lips. And my son looked at me with a mixture of rage and fear, as if he suddenly understood that the floor beneath his feet was crumbling. In that instant, I didn't feel pride or satisfaction. I felt pain, a deep pain, but also a serenity I hadn't felt in years. Because for the first time in a long time, I had spoken my truth without fear, without staying silent, without letting others erase me. And seeing their faces, watching the mask of success crack in front of everyone, I knew that this gesture would be the beginning of something much bigger. The humiliation I had suffered wasn't erased, but now they knew the truth. And that truth, naked and relentless, could never be hidden again. I hadn't even made it back to my table when he, his face contorted and his eyes full of fury, stood up and came toward me. The music was completely off now. The guests were whispering in an uncomfortable silence, like spectators at a drama they never expected to see at a wedding. He confronted me in the middle of the ballroom, his voice breaking with rage and wounded pride. "What the hell did you do? You ruined everything. You embarrassed me in front of everyone." His tone wasn't that of a son speaking to a father, but of a cornered man desperately looking for someone to blame. I looked at him calmly, with the kind of calm that only comes from enduring too much. I didn't answer right away, and that silence only enraged him more. He pointed a trembling finger at me and shouted, "It's always the same with you. You always want to be the center of attention, to make yourself look important. You can't stand seeing someone else get recognition. You're selfish." Those words hit me like stones. Me, selfish. I, who had given my life so he could reach this moment. I, who had worked until I had no strength left, who had mortgaged my dreams to finance his. I felt indignation shoot through me like a lightning bolt, but I held my ground, because I knew that everything I said or did would be watched and remembered by everyone. "Selfish," I repeated quietly, and my words echoed in the music-free hall. "You dare to call me selfish? After I put every last penny of my savings into this wedding? After you pointed at me with contempt in front of everyone, as if I were a burden, as if I meant nothing?" My voice was shaking, not with fear, but with pain. He held my gaze, arrogant, and shot back. "I didn't ask you for anything. You're the one who wanted to pay. Nobody forced you." That was the hardest blow of all. Not because he was right, but because it revealed the sheer depth of his ingratitude. To him, my sacrifices had never been an act of love, but an obligation he never asked for. And that made me understand that there wasn't just a broken bridge between us, but an impossible abyss. The guests looked at each other, some with second-hand embarrassment, others with morbid curiosity, waiting for the scandal to grow. His wife tried to calm him down, pulling on his arm, and his father-in-law watched in silence, his face pale, knowing that the entire building of appearances they had constructed was collapsing. He didn't stop. He kept accusing me, saying I had always made him feel small, that I never trusted him, that I used everything I did to remind him that he owed me. "I don't owe you anything," he yelled, and that phrase hung in the air like a death sentence, because it wasn't just an outburst of anger. It was what he truly believed. He never saw my sleepless nights and my sacrifices as a gift. He always saw them as chains. And in that instant, I knew I had lost him. The boy who once called me his hero had died a long time ago, replaced by a man who despised me. I didn't respond with more yelling, because I understood that rage was useless. Instead, I looked him directly in the eyes and said, "You're right. You don't owe me anything. And for that same reason, from this day on, you will receive nothing more from me. No money, no help, no support. You chose to embarrass me. You chose to erase my name from your life. Well, son, so be it. From this moment on, you're alone." My voice was serene, but I felt every fiber of my being tremble as I spoke those words. It was like tearing out a piece of my own soul, but it was necessary. A murmur swept through the room. Some tried to intervene, others were frozen. My son opened his mouth to argue, but found no words. His expression was a mix of hatred and bewilderment. I think for the first time, he understood that I was serious, that this wasn't an empty threat. The man he had treated like a shadow was finally claiming his place, even if it was only to take back everything he had ever given. I turned around and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I left the lights, the flowers, the interrupted music, and all those expectant faces looking for a show. I didn't look back, because I knew if I did, I might break. I left the ballroom with a broken heart, but with the certainty that I had taken the first step toward cutting a chain that tied me to a son who no longer existed. That night, as I walked alone through the illuminated streets, the echo of the argument still ringing in my ears, I understood that my life had changed forever. The battle between father and son had erupted in front of everyone, and while it had left me scarred, it had also set me free. Because in his final cry, in his "I don't owe you anything," I found the truth I had refused to accept for years. He had never loved me the way I loved him, and that truth, as painful as it was, would be the beginning of something bigger. The morning after the wedding was one of the longest of my life. I returned home with the knot still in my throat, his words stuck in me like a knife. "I don't owe you anything." That phrase haunted me as I took off my jacket, as I turned on the dim dining room light, and as I poured myself a glass of water I couldn't drink. I sat at the empty table and found myself thinking about something I had never wanted to confront before. What does blood really mean? For more than 60 years, I believed that being a father was a destiny sealed by biology, an invisible chain that bound a son to his father, beyond all mistakes, beyond all words. But that night, I understood that blood, without love, without respect, without gratitude, is just a useless fluid. I remembered my own father, a tough, quiet man who rarely hugged me, but whose presence was a rock I could lean on. He never said he loved me, but he showed it in the way he held me up when I fell, in the bread he put on the table even when he sometimes didn't eat, in the shoes he bought me at the cost of his own bleeding calluses. And I, though I judged him when I was young for his severity, never despised him. I never dared to look at him with mockery, much less humiliate him. On the contrary, today I remember him with respect and a gratitude that burns, and I wonder what happened between him and me, and between my son and me, for that chain to break. Maybe blood isn't a guarantee of anything. Maybe you can raise a son and still lose him. Maybe a son can grow up under your roof, feed on your sacrifice, and still become someone who denies your name. That thought filled me with such a deep sadness that I felt the need to search for answers in my own memories, as if at some point in his upbringing I had made an unforgivable mistake. Was I too hard? Was I too soft? Did I not listen when I should have? Did I give him so much that I made him incapable of valuing anything? I found myself reviewing the most intimate moments of our relationship, the nights I told him made-up stories to get him to sleep, the time he asked me to carry him on my shoulders to see a parade, and I, my back already tired, lifted him up anyway, because his smile was worth more than my pain. I remembered when I defended him at school after an injustice, and he looked at me with those eyes full of admiration, as if I were invincible. When was that look lost? When did he stop seeing me as a hero and start seeing me as an obstacle? The weight of blood became an unbearable burden, because it wasn't just about him. It was my own identity that was at stake. I'm not a businessman, or a politician, or someone who appears in society photos. I'm a man who worked with his hands, who saved every penny, who sacrificed his own dreams for his son. And yet, despite all that dedication, I was stripped of the one thing that mattered most, the recognition that, however imperfect, I was his father. Without that, what did I have left? Throughout that dark night, a bitter reflection washed over me. Maybe the mistake was mine, for clinging to the idea that blood cures everything, that in time, every son eventually recognizes his father. I was wrong. Blood by itself is not enough. Blood without values, without memory, without dignity. It's not a bond. It's a broken rope. And then I understood something that chilled me. My son and I shared the same blood, yes, but we no longer shared the same story. He had chosen to renounce it. As dawn broke and the timid sunlight slipped through the blinds, I came to a conclusion that changed me forever. If blood didn't stop him from showing contempt, it wouldn't stop me from seeking justice. I had protected him his entire life because I felt he was part of me, because my blood ran in his veins. But if he himself denied that bond, what was stopping me from denying it too? A father's love is unconditional, they say, but even the purest love can die when it's trampled too many times. And so, between the pain and the rage, I began to form the idea that would stay with me in the following days. I couldn't just sit back. I couldn't resign myself to being the humiliated old man from the wedding. The weight of blood was no longer a bond. It was a burden. And if he had chosen to break it in front of everyone, then I could also break it on paper, in the bank accounts, in the will. Because there is something stronger than blood, the truth. And the truth had to come out, even if it meant leaving him with nothing. Blood made him my son, yes, but his actions made him my enemy. And you don't mourn enemies. You face them. The days after the wedding passed like an endless echo of shame and fury. In every corner of my house, I could still hear the laughter of those 400 people who witnessed my humiliation. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my son's arrogant gesture, pointing his glass at me as if I were just a piece of furniture in the room. I tried to distract myself with work in the shop, with the wood, the nails, the smell of varnish, but my hands no longer obeyed with the same patience. The rage seeped into every cut, every hammer strike, and I found myself destroying more pieces than I managed to finish. I wasn't myself. I wasn't the man who had always found calm in quiet effort. I'd become someone different, someone awakened by the shock of pain and betrayal. And it was in that state, between helplessness and heartbreak, that I understood I couldn't stay still. I had to do something. At first, I fooled myself, thinking I wanted justice, that I was looking for a way to make my son understand how wrong he was, to show him the value of every sacrifice he despised. But the truth, and it was hard to admit, was that I was looking for revenge. Not a bloody revenge, not one of empty screams, but a cold, silent, calculated revenge. A revenge that had to be built with the same precision I had always used to build furniture, measuring every board, every nail, every angle. If I had spent my life building for him, now I would build against him. The first step was to review my accounts, my savings, everything I still had. For decades, I had patiently saved every dollar. I invested in small plots of land, a couple of modest properties, in the workshop that was my refuge. All of B-roll. This was part of an estate I had imagined leaving to him as an inheritance. It was my way of making sure that when I was gone, he would have a safety net, a solid foundation to keep growing on. That idea had always given me peace, until now. Because now, as I reviewed the papers and balances, I understood that these properties, this land, this workshop, they wouldn't be his salvation, they would be my weapon. I went to see an old attorney, a man I'd trusted for years. I asked him to help me reorganize my will. He looked at me in surprise because he knew that just a few months earlier, I had come in to strengthen the inheritance in my son's favor. Now, however, I asked him to erase his name from everything. I want to make it clear, I told him, my voice firm, that my son will receive nothing, not $1, not one piece of land, not this workshop I built with my own hands. I want everything to go to a different cause, to someone who will value it, to anyone but him. The attorney tried to talk me out of it. He spoke about the importance of forgiveness, of family, of blood. I listened to him in silence, and then I replied, "Blood doesn't matter anymore. The humiliation is what matters, and that has a price." He didn't argue further. He prepared the documents and asked for my signature. I trembled as I signed it, not from doubt, but from emotion. It was the first real step in my plan. The second step was to gather evidence. It wasn't enough to just erase his name from the will. I wanted everyone to know the truth, so no one could ever look at my son as an exemplary man, a model of success ever again. I took out the folder where I had kept the wedding bill, the receipts, the bank transfer confirmations, every invoice I had paid. I also found photos, emails, messages from vendors I had negotiated with for months to organize the event. I had in my hands the proof that, without me, that wedding would never have existed. And although I had already revealed part of it in the ballroom when I tore up the bill, now I wanted it in writing, disseminated, to become his cross to bear. I started writing a detailed account, a document narrating step by step what had happened, from my sacrifices as a young man to the humiliation at his wedding. I didn't skimp on details, I didn't hide my own mistakes, because I wanted it to be credible, undeniable. In it, I told how I raised him, how I sacrificed, how he denied me. That document wasn't just me venting, it was the foundation of my revenge. I printed several copies and put them in sealed envelopes, which I gave to trusted friends with clear instructions. If anything happened to me, they were to make it public. The third step was harder, confronting myself. Because revenge isn't just an act against someone else, it's also an act against who you used to be. I, who had always been a man of peace, had to accept that I was now a man willing to inflict pain. I looked in the mirror every morning and repeated to myself, "He is not your son anymore. He broke that bond himself." But still, deep down, a voice whispered, "You love him, and that's why it hurts." That contradiction tore me apart, but it also gave me strength, because I understood that there is no revenge more powerful than one born from betrayed love. Meanwhile, I watched my son from a distance. The news of what happened at the wedding had spread quickly among our acquaintances, and he was no longer receiving just praise, but also uncomfortable glances. His father-in-law, the man who had eclipsed him, seemed less inclined to show him off as a trophy. There were rumors of debts, of business deals falling through. And I, from a distance, watched him stumble. But I wasn't satisfied. I wanted him to fall completely, to feel firsthand what it's like to lose everything you thought was guaranteed. I began to design the final blow. It would be slow, meticulous, and above all, public. Because what he had done to me in private would have been painful, yes, but what he did in public was unbearable. And so his fall had to be public, loud, impossible to hide. I imagined the moment, a family gathering, a meeting with lawyers, an unexpected announcement, me revealing my will, showing my proof, stripping him of everything he expected to receive. I imagined his face, first disbelieving, then pale, finally devastated. Not because of the money, I know he'll find other ways to live, but because of the blow to his pride, to that perfect image he cared so much about. I imagined the reactions of others, some shocked, some embarrassed, some perhaps relieved to see the truth exposed, and me, serene, like a judge delivering a sentence. But I'm not fooling myself. I know this plan isn't just against him, it's also against me. Because with every step I take, I'm tearing away a piece of who I was, the man who carried him on his shoulders, who defended him at school, who bought him his first bicycle. That man is dying a little with every decision. And yet, I accept it. Because in this war, the only thing I have left is my dignity, and I will defend it to my last breath. At night, when the silence of the house surrounds me, I talk to Teresa again, even though she's gone. I blame her for raising our son in her shadow, for weakening me with her words, for planting the seed of contempt in him. I tell her that now her son's inheritance will be shame, that just as she left me the burden of the truth, I will return it to him, multiplied. And although I know talking to a dead woman is useless, it gives me strength. Because every word I speak into that void is a reminder that I have nothing left to lose. And so, with each passing day, the plan solidifies. It's no longer a draft, no longer a wish. It's a reality, approaching like an inevitable storm. And deep in my heart, I know that when that day comes, when I make the final move, there will be no turning back. Because my son chose to deny me, and I have chosen to deny him. And in that mutual renunciation, in that abyss that can no longer be closed, there is only room for the coldest kind of justice, the justice of a father who no longer sees blood, but only betrayal. The morning I chose to close that chapter dawned with a clear sky, as if the world itself wanted to give me its silent approval. I prepared the house with the calm of someone organizing an intimate and final ceremony. I set the table with the good tablecloth Teresa would have wanted for a day without rush. I put old photographs on the walls and turned on a lamp that cast a warm light, similar to the afternoons when he was a child, and would come looking for me in the shop. We summoned the family with the excuse of reading some of Teresa's letters that I'd never been able to read aloud. Many came out of curiosity, out of habit, or in the hope that those words might somehow heal what was broken. Those who arrived with long faces and those who came with forced smiles sat around the table, never suspecting that this meeting, which seemed to be a tribute, would be the stage for a truth that could no longer be held in silence. I started by talking about Teresa. I spoke of her small smile, the way she arranged flowers in the kitchen, her habit of leaving breadcrumbs out for the birds. I spoke with tenderness and pain, and I watched their faces soften, their gazes turn to shared memories. I wanted the atmosphere to be clear. I hadn't come to spit venom. I'd come to repair with words what life had twisted. And then, when nostalgia had us all in its grip, I took out the folder with the evidence I had been gathering for months, the folder that held the timeline of what happened, the papers that explained why that wedding was paid for by my hands, and why my name deserved to be in the story that was told. I didn't show off. I opened the folder and laid out the story with surgical calm. The estimates, the down payments, the receipts in my name, the text messages with the ballroom vendor, the florist, the orchestra coordinator. I told them how I had fronted most of the cost, how I had mortgaged my savings for that day, believing it would be returned in the form of gratitude. I read excerpts from receipts, showed bank transfers and contracts. As I did, I watched the room. The father-in-law, who until recently had been smiling with self-satisfaction, showed a tightening in his jaw. Some people brought their hands to their mouths as if the shock were a physical blow. I didn't need to shout. The evidence was the clearest voice. With a calm voice, I also explained the reasons for my decision regarding the inheritance. I had consulted an attorney and changed my will. My assets would go to a scholarship fund for kids in the trades and to the community workshop I would be opening next month. I will leave nothing to the one who humiliated me, I said with a calm that chilled the room. I didn't ask for applause. I only asked that they listen. Many were surprised, others whispered. The father-in-law, who until a moment ago had been so smug, turned pale, his hands clenching into fists. My son tried to interrupt me with the bluster of a man who feels cornered, but I continued, because I wasn't looking to defeat him in a public scene. I was looking to establish, with facts, what I had said at the wedding. The one who organizes, the one who pays, also deserves recognition. There was pushback. Some said I was a bitter old man. Others argued that a family should solve its problems internally. There were tears and there were voices against me, but I also found support in faces I never expected. The gardener who had helped me set up so many times, my neighbor who worked as an accountant at City Hall and had seen irregularities in some invoices, an old friend who knew companies that overcharged for weddings of this caliber. I gave these men and women organized copies of the dossier and asked for their discretion until I decided it was time to open fire. Their support wasn't to feed my ego. It was to validate that what I was saying was real. As the afternoon wore on, I set the second part of the plan in motion. I contacted the press. I didn't do it out of a thirst for media-driven revenge, but from the need for the truth to travel far, for the perfect image they had built of my son to crack in the one place that mattered most to him. I gave a local reporter a dossier with the documents and a letter where I narrated, humbly and without hatred, everything I had experienced. I asked him to wait until I gave the signal. The story had to be published with rigor, with documents, not with speculation. That paper, which many in the city respected for its integrity, agreed to review the material and promised it would run when I gave the okay. This wasn't an easy act. At night, I wondered if I was doing the right thing, if my revenge would inflict irreparable wounds. It pained me to think of the harm his wife, my daughter-in-law, might suffer, of the guests who considered me a friend, of the grandchildren who might one day question their grandfather's memory. But then I remembered the sound of the ballroom, the mocking laughter, his dismissive gesture, and I was convinced. I couldn't go back. You don't recover dignity with silence. You recover it with actions that place it ahead of humiliation. And I knew that if I didn't act, the story would be perpetuated by those who celebrated his success without looking behind the curtain. The article came out a week later. I didn't want to see it right away. I drank my coffee on an empty stomach and thought about Teresa. I spoke to her in silence, telling her this was for her own daily effort, for her name. When I finally opened the page, the calls and messages started coming in. The article wasn't a lynching. It described the documents, the timeline, and the decisions I'd made about the will. It showed figures, names, and proof. The community reacted with surprise, with indignation, with heated conversations in town squares and coffee shops. Some were appalled. Others started calling him, looking for an explanation. Little by little, the image my son had tried to build was cracked, and with those cracks, his foundation of prestige began to crumble. The consequences for the family were devastating for some and liberating for others. The father-in-law, feeling exposed, tried to control the damage with financial offers and gestures of reparation that came too late and felt empty. My son lost contracts. The invitations to high society events dried up. His reputation, woven over years of appearances, suffered a public blow that hurt his vanity more than his wallet. The hardest part was seeing how some family members pulled away to protect themselves, how others looked at him with distance for the first time. But there were also those who approached me with sincerity. Old colleagues from the shop, neighbors who had known me my whole life, people my work had helped support. With them, I began to think about giving back what my hands had built. The months passed, and slowly, the anger transformed into work. With the money I was able to salvage, and with donations from those who believed in the cause, we set up the community workshop. I hired 2 eager apprentices and a woman who taught sewing. We painted walls, sanded tables. We talked to young people who had no opportunities and offered them training. The workshop became a living pulse that gave me back a sense of purpose. At the inauguration, I invited the community that had supported me so much. I saw emotional parents, kids with stained hands learning to build something they could later sell. I felt in every hug that the humiliation from that wedding was now serving a good purpose. One day, months later, I saw my son walk past the shop. He stopped, looked at the sign with the center's logo, and his shoulders slumped. He didn't come to ask for a job or to beg for recognition. He just watched from a distance. In his eyes, there was no longer the arrogance of the banquet. There was, for the first time, uncertainty. Maybe he understood something that was impossible for him to accept before. That life isn't measured by the applause in a photo, but by the bread you share and the hands that know how to create. Perhaps it was too late to restore what was broken between us. Perhaps some doors just don't open again. But that moment was enough for me. I watched his retreating figure blend into the afternoon light, and I knew my decision had sown something more than resentment. It had restored dignity. I closed the circle not with blind rage, but with the peace of a man who, at 61, learned that personal justice has 1,000 paths. I chose one that returned value to my craft, that protected Teresa's memory, and that at the same time showed my son the consequences of his contempt. Some called me harsh, others compassionate. I prefer to think I was fair. When we finally raised a glass in truth at the workshop's opening, it wasn't to celebrate someone's defeat. It was to toast to recovered dignity and to the young people the world had denied a chance. And in that toast, surrounded by calloused hands and sincere smiles, I understood that I had won the only thing that truly belonged to me: respect for my own life, and the peace of knowing that at least my name would no longer be erased by the gesture of a son who chose to forget where he came from.